And so flip side, the other side of that, what would be your advice to someone like me or someone in that arena? Maybe like my mom would also be a good example of this. And anyone in our group, actually,
Sure.
someone who, Gentile believer, who starts to understand that, like I've come to understand that, this isn't a Jew versus Christian debate. Matter of fact, I think that's a very unhelpful framing of it.
I think you're right.
And especially in the Gentile world, where it's like, oh, those Jews, they just don't get it. Like, how would they not understand?
Yeah.
Right. And that's a
right.
complicated answer, as we've just gone through with your
Right.
story.
That's right.
And so I think that there's been a lot of this like shrugging off of Jewishness, let's say, in the evangelical world. I'd say probably really since Luther, very heavily since Luther.
That's a special set of problems.
Yeah.
Right.
And maybe we've talked about that a little bit on this podcast, Reformation, but maybe we can have another debate about that at some point, because I think it would be very interesting. And I would like to do more research. But point being that, I think it's a good thing that this is happening. I think there's a very good resurgence, or resurgence is maybe the best way to say it, of Gentile Christians who now understand that that wrestling with things maybe in a more Jewish way, or understanding the Jewishness, and doesn't, like you said, that doesn't mean that I give up my relationship with Jesus. Matter of fact, it might even make it better, which is what I've experienced. So I guess what would be your advice as someone who's Jewish to somebody who's a Gentile, kind of starting to wrestle with and parse through maybe some new things that come up through conversations with, Messianic Jews, or even Jews in general, who don't take Jesus as Messiah? Like, what would be your advice to them? Maybe a book you'd recommend, or something like that, to kind of help that area, because I think that I think it's necessary, but I think a lot of people don't know where to start.
So to understand your question correctly, you're saying, so you as a Gentile believer may have the opportunity to talk to an unbelieving Jewish person, and how would you break the ice?
No.
Okay. Let me get it straight.
My question is more or less, how, as a Gentile believer, do I begin to understand the Jewishness of my faith, and not feel like I am abandoning my Christianity for Judaism, or feel like or even on the extreme case, feel like I have to become Jewish in some sense, because I think that dichotomy is largely unhelpful.
I think I better understand that. That's actually also a very, very compelling question. There's probably no greater value in Judaism as a society or a civilization than learning. So that should be applied to everybody. We should all be striving to learn. The more we learn, the better we are. And the idea of being challenged or being confused is acceptable, very much so, because that makes you look harder. That makes you work more at getting to those answers. Yes, I think we're living in a time where the emergence of a scholarship school, Messianic scholarship, let's call it, has become very much more acceptable in the Gentile scholarship circles. Mm-hmm. Yes, you brought up the new
perspective.
The new perspective, and lots of stuff is coming out about that, with plenty of argumentation taking place, and that's okay too. So I think that, of course, the more you learn and the more you understand the roots, the Jewish roots, and that goes into two major categories. First of all, there's why weren't you taught those in the first place? Because they were removed through the councils and through Constantine and others who wanted to Gentilize this new faith and make it have nothing to do with Judaism, which was very tragic, really. But now we're beyond that. We've matured as a society and culture that we can say, okay, it's totally reasonable to study the Jewish roots and try to see what we can glean from that in terms of our understanding of our faith. And again, the historical details of things like the Last Supper, I'll use an example. A very, very serious event that not only was a big part of the course of, Christendom as we understand it, but also it was also the beginning of the institution of a rite, of a new ritual, which really wasn't a new ritual because it came out of a Jewish roots place. So understanding that changes our, dynamic when it comes to realizing what he was saying. In the case of that, we could talk about a separate discussion, but I think that, learning about what Passover was to the Jewish people then, what it is now, what it was like in his time, how is it different, how is it similar, just expands your knowledge base. And if you are going to encounter an unbelieving Jewish person, you now have information that you can discuss this with them on a level that they don't necessarily withdraw from or become offended by, that kind of thing. And again, that's another discussion. That was the other misunderstanding of your question that I was drawing to, allusion to. But I don't think that there's anything better than just taking the time to learn, and with the abundant amount of information that's readily available at our fingertips today, with things like the internet and with electronic media for books and for videos and you name it, DVDs, etc. There's just a ton of material out there on the Jewish roots. Have to be careful, obviously, to use discernment like anything else, because there's nonsense out there too, but there's also good stuff. You asked about a specific book. I recommend people reading and studying the works of a gentleman whose name is Daniel Stern. Now, Dr. Stern is still alive. He's quite elderly. He lives in Jerusalem. He was an economist by training, so he had a lot of, very significant education, you can imagine. And anyway, became a Jewish believer, and then decided that he wanted to, quote, restore the Jewishness to the Gospels. And in so doing, he produced a book called Restoring the Jewishness to the Gospels, and it's worth reading. He also has a book that was titled Messianic Manifesto, Messianic Judaism or something Manifesto. The name has been recently changed to a different, but it's easy to find out on the internet what it is. But he is extremely good at being able to explain where the schisms were. How can we try to bridge those gaps between the cultures and be able to discuss and build bridges instead of walls, basically. And not only Stern, with those books, he also undertook incredible scholarly effort by producing the complete Jewish Bible. And this is, again, a Greek and Hebrew Bible that is degentilized. The names, for example, of the people in the New Testament are given their original Hebrew names. So John would be called Yochanan, and Matthew would be Matityahu. Does that make any big difference? Well, it might make a difference to a Jewish person. You know what I'm saying? So he wrote that, and then he wrote a commentary on the Jewish New Testament, which is just invaluable. It's phenomenal. And that is a very important resource also, because you can read something out of a classic Bible that gives an explanation in a footnote, and then you can see what his footnote says. And maybe they're similar, or maybe he agrees that that's one interpretation versus another interpretation. And it just broadens your knowledge. There's another scholar who's named Stuart Dowerman, Dauermann. And Stuart is a Jewish believer that came up in the Jews for Jesus movement back in the 70s, in the early days when Jews for Jesus first started. He was a musician, so he was involved with their singing and performing troupe, which was called the Liberated Wailing Wall, and they still exist. And Stuart went on to develop more scholarship, more education, and then now has become quite a spokesman, I should say, among Messianic scholars for his biggest goal, and that is, like I said, building bridges between the Judaism, the Messianic Judaism and Christianity, to what are they, what do they have in common? Where do they have differences? What can we do to reconcile certain things? And he's written extensively on that. And if you're a Facebook person, I would follow him on Facebook. He's very, very interesting. And he's controversial, and he riles people up, and he gets all kinds of crazy comments, but he's very, very worth exploring. And these are just a few people. There's many other, I could name names, of people in the scholarship, academic scholarship world of Messianic Judaism. There's a journal, a Messianic journal called Kesher, which is similar to the word kosher. And these are very scholarly, peer-reviewed articles, etc. The Messianic theologians now have well organized into a number of different groups that have internet websites with articles and videos. There's plenty of material out there. It's just very, very, and of course, in typical fashion, the old joke about asking Jews for opinions. If you ask 3 Jews for an opinion, you get 9 answers. And so in the Messianic circles, surprise, surprise, they disagree with each other. And what do? They branch off. They're this way or that way, or Torah observant or not Torah observant, whatever it is. And but we can still learn from that. We can still find a place that's comfortable for us in the midst of these differing opinions. From a believer like myself, looking at Christianity from the outside, as an outsider for many, many years, my main observation was that Christian Gentile people were arguing about inconsequential stuff. How to get baptized, how to do this, how to do that, how many days do you count before Christmas, and whatever. That's all I could see. So then I become a member of the tribe, so to speak, in that respect. And I get into being a believer, a Christian, a Jewish believer. And now that I'm on the inside, I make another observation. All we do is fight about nonsense. It's the thing with the Jewish believers. They have, they've taken sides, if you will, or they've, cordoned themselves off into different organizations that just bicker and fight and whatever. And I think guys like Dowerman and Stern are trying to dispense with that. I think they're trying to get them to all talk to each other, and not because they have to have a unified voice, but because we just have to set aside certain things that aren't worth fighting about. That's all. And then what is the essential goal of anybody that believes in Jesus in terms of their personal responsibility? And that is to go and make disciples. And that may be either by witnessing or by your behavior or by donating to missionaries or whatever it is. There's a lot of ways to do it. But that's our main responsibility, and not fight with each other about how you get baptized.